will enjoy. And if you're interested, this book is available on Amazon, and I'll put the link for that in the description box below also. The weeks following the train wreck stretched into the hottest August in recent memory. The cooling shade of the stately oak and elm trees that canopied Main Street was eagerly sought by neighborhood children. Kids played under the foliage to avoid the direct rays of the intense, blazing sun. As boys, it was our duty to brave the sultry heat and play ball, but we managed to fulfill our duty to the game in the cool of the early morning, before the blistering sun reached its full potential. Temperatures soared to triple digits and the humidity to 90% plus. When the day heated to the point that the ball diamond became a virtual oven, we abandoned it for cooler pursuits, mostly in the shade of the tall trees in front of the big house, or later in the day for the swimming pool. Fortunately, grass didn't grow much in the heat of August, so it wasn't necessary to mow. While the kids were hiding out under the shade trees, the old man was sweating at the steel fabrication shop all day long. Huge fans on the factory floor kept the air moving as the men heated metal with their torches and welded the steel. Steel left in direct sunlight in the storage yard was too hot to touch without gloves and had to be allowed to cool in the shade of the building before being measured, cut, or welded. The old man came home from the shop every day soaked as if someone had dumped a bucket of water over him. On a couple of particularly sweltering evenings, he took the whole family to the swimming pool after work so everyone could cool off. Since the big house didn't have air conditioning, it was well into the late evening before things cooled to anything even closely resembling a comfortable sleeping temperature. On one of those exceptionally hot August afternoons, two of my buddies, Don and Jimmy, decided we needed to go ride our bicycles to the county seat to see a girl. Don and Jimmy were brothers who were only about 13 months apart in age. Don, who was older of the brothers, knew the girl and thought it was a most excellent idea to go see her. Plans were laid for the next day with all the insight, or lack of it, given to young boys. With no thought whatsoever for the rising temperatures and stifling humidity, the three of us set off on our bicycles toward the county seat 15 miles away. We left in the early morning when the cool morning air had not yet been affected by the brutal August sun. Dew was still on the grass as we pedaled away from the big house and headed south for the city. Following the county road paralleling the railroad, we passed through fields of head-high corn on both sides of the road, waving softly in the gentle breeze as we labored on. Initial shouts of bantering gave way to labored pedaling as the first hour wore into the second, and the temperature slowly began to rise, matching the sun's climb into the summer sky. Shimmering heat waves produced imaginary pools of water hovering over the oily road. The tar and chip surface turned into a bubbling cauldron of tar with no sign of a stone chips under the sticky black surface. Our tires produced a crackling sound as the tires passed over the pools of hot tar, then pulled away from the sticky surface as they rolled along. As the three stout-hearted, if not too bright boys labored southward for the sake of a girl, my grandmother Jessie was in the kitchen of her farmhouse about 6 miles from town. The house was set back from the road about 150 feet or so, in front of a barnyard. The farm consisted of 2 enormous white barns, a garage, corn cribs, and a workshop huddled between the barns, all surrounded by the blanket house was back a gravel lane which continued past the house to the original freestanding one-car garage and the barns. The kitchen was a spacious, comfortable room, painted in off-white. It had old-fashioned cupboards and a dinette for everyday service. There was a formal dining room next to the kitchen for the more formal occasions when Grandma was entertaining. That morning, Grandma had been buttering in the kitchen, getting ready to leave for an errand in town. Her husband, Ralph, was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. They filled the air with the kind of meaningless small talk that frequently occurs between two very intelligent people who are not only husband and wife, but also good friends. The mood was light, and Grandma would answer in kind to Ralph's comments about articles he found interesting in the newspaper. A comment was offered regarding a fundraiser for the fire department. The department was trying to raise money to purchase some piece of equipment discovered necessary after the train wreck. My grandmother quickly made a disparaging comment about the needs of the fire department being overrated. Ralph lowered his paper and peered over the top curiously, then asked a question. "What do you mean their needs are overrated?" asked Ralph. "Those guys did a terrific job on the train wreck." Ralph laid the paper on the table and continued. "That deal didn't turn into a real disaster, and it sure could have. They might have saved the whole town from those chemicals." Ralph had been a member of the volunteer fire department earlier in his life, and accorded the men the enormous respect for their volunteer service. In fact, he was quite taken aback by the venom of Jessie's comment. "Well, I just think that all they ever do is race around town driving too fast whenever that darn siren blows," said Jessie, as she washed a coffee cup at the sink and looked out the window. "Now, wait a minute," replied Ralph. "You know that's not true. Okay, some of them do get a little wild once in a while going to the firehouse, but you know why that happens." He hesitated for emphasis, then continued. "They're just trying to get there quick enough to keep things from getting out of hand, and you know that. So what you're talking about driving too fast," he continued with a furrowed brow. "I just think there's too much self-interest in those guys. All they ever think about is the lights and sirens on their cars, so they can drive too fast," replied my grandmother. After sitting quietly, considering her remark carefully, for some 30 or 40 seconds, Ralph said, "This is about Jack, isn't it? It doesn't have nothing to do with the fire department." Ralph continued in an accusing tone. "You just don't like it because Jack has red lights and a siren on his car." Jessie colored visibly and replied quickly, "No, of course not. That's not it. They all drive too fast." Ralph, realizing that he had hit on the answer, pressed on. "Jesus, Jessie, is it really so bad? Have you decided everyone on the fire department is driving too fast just 'cause Jack has red lights and a siren on his car? That's not right, and you know it." Grandma's color deepened even further as Ralph continued. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to you run down the whole bunch just because you don't get along with your son-in-law. I'm going to the shop." With that last word, Ralph got up and left his coffee cup and newspaper on the table, pulled on his work boots by the door, and stalked out of the kitchen, headed to his workshop by the barn. As Ralph walked out the door of the house, Don, Jimmy, and I pedaled furiously up the slight grade in front of the farmhouse. Ralph saw us when we got a little closer, shouted, "What the hell are you boys doing riding out here in this kind of heat?" We coasted into the driveway, thankful for the slight downhill incline. As Ralph walked the lane to meet us, he was grinning now, the conversation with Grandma forgotten, knowing boys considered themselves indestructible without ever using so many words. "Where are you guys going anyway?" he asked, as we glided to a stop near the house. "We're going to see a girl I know down at the county seat," replied Don, with a wide grin. "A girl I might have known," said Ralph, with a chuckle. "That's a long way, you know. Did you bring water?" Don, who seemed to be doing all the talking, replied sheepishly, Well, no, we didn't bring any water." "We didn't think of it." "I figured as much," answered Ralph. "You go up to the house. Jesse's got some ice-cold lemonade in the icebox. In the meantime, I'll see if I can scare up a canteen or two for the rest of your trip." We dropped our bicycles on the lawn and headed to the house, eager for the promised icy drink. Grandma, upon seeing us headed for the house, had sweating glasses of iced lemonade waiting for us as we came in the back door. "Hi, Grandma," I called from the door. "Hello yourself," she answered. "You boys look like you could use some lemonade." "Could we ever?" said Don as his younger brother followed him in the door. "We'll sit down at the table. The glasses are waiting on you," said Grandma. After serving up the lemonade and putting a plate of cookies on the table, she inquired as to what kind of adventure we were on today. After a quick explanation and the expected warnings to be careful of the heat and drink plenty of water, Ralph reappeared in the kitchen climbing an olive drab web belt with a canteen attached and another 1-quart canteen with a long leather strap. "This ought to hold you guys for a while," he said. "Just bring it back next time you're out this way." After greedily wolfing down all the cookies and drinking the cool lemonade, we were sufficiently refreshed to continue our journey. The banter about who was going to get there first, who was the best rider, and how fast we could ride picked up as we glided out of Ralph and Jesse's driveway and onto the road still shimmering with heat mirages, always just a little further down the road. As we headed out of the driveway, Ralph and Jesse watched from the windows over the kitchen sink. Ralph, shaking his head, commented that we were on our way to see a girl, and that nothing in the world would keep young boys from visiting girls, even the heat. Then, as he backed away from the window, he asked, "Are you still going into town today?" "Yes, I was planning on it," Jesse answered, "but I don't think I'll go till later in the afternoon." "Would you stop at the hardware store and tell Russ I need about half a dozen 3-inch carriage bolts and some WD-40, asked Ralph. "Of course. Do you need anything from the grocery while I'm there?" replied Jessie. "No, can't think of anything," Ralph said, and headed back out the door to the shop. 2 hours later found us pedaling toward the curve of the state highway at the north edge of the county seat. Don's girl lived in a large English Tudor-style house that naturally enough was on the south end of town, near her father's dental office. The house was a rambling affair with 5 bedrooms and God only knew how many bathrooms. We headed south of town, thankful for the shady trees lining the highway. We moved closer to the edge of the road to take better advantage of the shade and found it much cooler there than it had been pedaling in the direct sunlight. By now, most of the water Ralph had given us was gone, so we stopped at a cool, shady park a few blocks into town and filled the canteens at the pump. We remounted and pedaled past the red brick Masonic building, the National Guard Armory. With its facade of enormous stones and barred windows, Sheriff Willow Ridge's office and jail, then on to the courthouse square. Temptation was great to stop at the drugstore on the square and avail ourselves of the soda fountain. But Don wanted to reach the girl's house before the day got too late, so we cruised on south across the railroad tracks and into one of the nicer neighborhoods. We arrived at the house, which sat on the corner lot, soaked with sweat and with more streaming from our bodies every second. We must have smelled like lathered horses or old goats, but Don went to the door anyway and asked for his friend. All to no avail. She was at the swimming pool. Somewhat dejected, Don returned to where Jimmy and I were sitting on the lawn, resting in the shade against the trunk of an elm tree. "She ain't here," exclaimed the disappointed Don. "What do you mean she ain't here?" Jimmy shouted at his brother. "You mean you didn't check to see if she was gonna be home before we pedaled our asses all the way down here? Man, you're a real dumbass. Even dumber than you look." "Yeah, I know," replied Don dejectedly, more subdued than usual, considering it was his little brother that was the one being critical. Don continued, "I was just sure she'd be here." "Where is she, do you know?" I asked. "Yeah," said Don, "she's at the swimming pool." "Well, what are we waiting for?" I asked. "Wouldn't be anything wrong with us going there, too." "That's a great idea," Don answered, suddenly excited again. "But what about swimming suits? We don't have any trunks." "We all got shorts on. What do they care?" I said, thinking about how good the cool water of the swimming pool was going to feel. "Well, what are we waiting for?" said Jimmy, who also had that swimming sounds like a great idea look in his eyes. We mounted our bikes and flew out of the driveway, headed for the prospect of cool water, and the ever-present fountain bubbling in the center of the pool, bringing more cool water. The trip to the pool took us past the municipal airport, and we sailed along. Jimmy noticed an old C-47 parked on the ramp. Jimmy was an airplane nut. He loved them all. Big ones, little ones, bombers, fighters, jets. He loved anything that flew. Jimmy would, in fact, grow up to become an officer in the United States Air Force. He retired a bird colonel commanding a flight wing in the Material Aircraft Command Station at Ikirlik, Turkey. He still loves anything that flies, and no one is ever more committed to his passion than Jimmy. Jimmy's love of airplanes drew us onto the airfield to look over the parked C-47. The C-47 is a military version of the Douglas DC-3, which is, in its civilian life, was a twin-engine passenger and cargo aircraft. While we were on the field, Don noticed several smaller planes parked on the apron near the runway and walked over to take a look. "Hey, these things aren't locked up," Don called as he pulled open the door of a Piper Cub. "Get away from there," shouted Jimmy from the near wing of a C-47. "You aren't supposed to be in someone else's airplane." It won't hurt anything," Don called back as he climbed into the cockpit of the teeny plane. I looked over at Jimmy and decided that without question, this was the time to unass the area, because Don was about to get in big trouble, big time, and I didn't want it to rub off. I mounted my bike and called to Jimmy. "I'm out of here, buddy. I'll see you guys at the road if Don doesn't get caught." And with that, I hustled out of the airport to the highway, finding a tree to sit under until Jimmy could convince Don to leave the airplane. Jimmy quickly ran to where Don was now playing with the controls of the aircraft. "What the hell do you think you're doing, stupid?" Jimmy asked. "I'm just checking it out," replied Don. "Yeah, you'll check it out from jail if the sheriff gets a hold of you," Jimmy said. "Man, you know you ain't supposed to be in there. Let's get out of here before someone finds out." Just a minute. There's some stuff in here you ought to see." "Look at this," cried Don. Then he reached out and pushed a button on the dashboard of the plane, and with a whining sound, the propeller turned slightly as the started motor groaned. Don jerked his finger away from the button, and both movement and sound stopped. "We gotta get out of here," exclaimed Don, sliding out of the pilot's seat to the ground. "Well, no "Oh shit, Dick Tracy," replied Jimmy in the disgusted "I told you so" kind of voice. "Come on." Jimmy and Don mounted their bicycles at top speed to get out of the hot pursuit of my bike, which was already gone from sight down the highway. They found me a few hundred yards down the road, propped against a shade tree, with my bike leaning against a fence. "Well, did you get caught?" I asked, somewhat smugly. "No, but Dumb Shay here tried to start a plane," answered Jimmy. "No, I didn't," Don retorted. "I didn't know that button was gonna turn it on." "You shouldn't have been messing with it anyway," was Jimmy's stubborn answer. "Well, as long as you didn't break anything, there shouldn't be any trouble," I said philosophically. "You guys ready for the pool now?" "Yeah," said Jimmy. "Let's go." We pumped up the speed. In a matter of minutes, we're coasting into the parking lot of the city pool next to the lush golf course. The fountain at the center of the pool was spilling out its cool invitation, and minutes later we had checked out our sweaty t-shirt and tennis shoes, and were walking on the hot concrete of the pool apron. Jimmy and I plunged into the cool water, while Don walked over to where the girl that had started the quest was lying on a beach towel. As Jimmy and I were splashing into the pool for the first time that afternoon, my grandmother was gathering her purse and heading for her Dodge Dart to drive into town. The car was an old shade of luminescent green with a black vinyl top. It had a 318 cubic inch cylinder engine and an automatic transmission that created a much higher power to weight ratio than my grandmother was ever going to need. But it was the proverbial screamin' machine. She could have been the little old lady from Pasadena in that car. As Jessie got into the car in her normal, fastidious manner, she carefully fastened her seatbelt and shoulder harness. This was one of the cars that provided such a system, and she used it religiously. She cautiously backed the car out the overhead garage door and eased it onto the gravel lane headed to town. The highway was still shimmering as she pulled onto the highway and pointed the car toward town. The fields of waving corn enveloped her on both sides as she guided the car down the ribbon-like path between stalks. As she approached the highway junction with an offshoot highway that joined about 2 miles from her house, she could not see any oncoming traffic from the other road due to the tall corn. She absently decided, without any real conscious thought, that there was a stop sign for the other road, but not for her, and proceeded without slowing at all. Just as she reached the intersection, she saw a flash of motion out of the corner of her eye, and suddenly the world exploded. Another car coming from the merging highway had slowed, but not stopped at the stop sign. The other driver's view was equally obstructed by the corn, and he did not see Grandma's car approaching the intersection. His car was a much heavier Olds Delta 88, and as both cars entered the intersection, it slammed into the side of Jessie's Dodge Dart, sending glass flying in all directions. Crying tires screamed as both cars spun out of control. Jessie's car was flung sideways from the impact. As the little Dodge Dart slid to the edge of the roadway, and a bare fraction of a second later, the car began to roll. It flipped completely over and back onto its wheels. Earth, sky, earth, sky, earth, sky. Then one more flip onto its top, coming to a rest in the ditch with Jessie hanging upside down in her seatbelt as the car rocked to a stop on top, like an enormous upside-down turtle. A nearby farmhouse was close enough for Queenie McBride to hear the impact. She had lived near this intersection for a very long time and knew what that sound meant. She calmly looked across the mowed lawn toward the highway intersection where she could just make out the cars involved in the wreck. Through the corn, she picked up the kitchen phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Sheriff Woolridge's office. Can I help you? Answered the dispatcher. There's been an accident at the intersection south of town, said Queenie, in an equally calm voice of one who had made such a phone call many times. I can't tell from here if anyone is hurt or not. Thank you, replied the male voice. Can you hold while I get emergency services rolling? Yes, I can hold, replied Queenie as the line went dead. As Queenie waited patiently for the dispatcher to come back on the line, he had reset his phone and punched the speed dial for the village fire department. Moments later, a breathless voice answered. Fire department, PJ speaking. This is the sheriff's office. We have a report of a possible injury accident at the state highway intersection 2 miles south of town. I don't have any reporting party's info yet, but if you'll give me a call after the excitement dies down, I'll have it for you, said the dispatcher. Okay, the highway intersection, injury accident. Any idea how many vehicles involved? Asked BJ as he reached out across his desk to push and hold a big, large. Any idea how many vehicles involved? Asked BJ as he reached across his desk to push and hold a large red button on an unadorned electrical junction box. I didn't ask that, but it's usually 2 out there, replied the dispatch. Yeah, that's true. Okay, man, we're on the way, said BJ and hung up. As the line went dead in the dispatcher's ear, he leaned back from the console so that he had an uninterrupted view into the sheriff's private office and said, Hey, Jim, there's a wreck out on highway intersection up north. Anybody hurt? Was the disjointed reply from the deep bass voice that remained unseen in the office. Dunno yet, was the answer from the radio room. Okay, Benji, I'm on my way, called the deep voice, still unseen. Better get the cavalry up and running. Already on the way, replied the dispatcher smoothly, returning to his phones. In a smooth, fluid motion, Sheriff Jim Woolridge heaved his large body out of the desk chair where he had been struggling with the budget numbers and headed for the door to the residence. Sheriff Woolridge lived in half of the lower floor, and the upstairs of the old brick Victorian served as the county jail. This was a tradition dating from the earliest days of the county to save money in the sheriff's pay by furnishing living quarters. He walked through the door into the residence, then into the kitchen. He spoke briefly to his wife, Anne Marie, who was in the early stages of preparing dinner, telling her that there was an accident and he might be late for dinner. Jim then proceeded out of the back door of the building to a small parking area where his nearly new beige unmarked Chevrolet sat backed into a parking space. He unlocked the car and slid behind the wheel, firing the engine and fastening his seatbelt all at the same time. As the car lurched into gear, the rotating light on the dashboard and the alternating flashers in the rear window began to pulse, and the headlights also began to wink out alternating pattern. The sheriff guided the car carefully out of the parking lot onto the street and then pointed it north to the state highway. As he gathered speed, reaching down to turn on the siren, and was immediately rewarded with the whining wail shriek as the siren began to cycle. At the same time the sheriff was leaving his desk, PJ hung up the phone, and the big siren across the street above the fire station groaned to life with a growling "Rrrr." Electricity hit the motor driving the siren and cycled. Then, as PJ was writing the location on a pad of paper, the siren wound from a low growl to a high-pitched scream, and in that moment was heard faintly by my grandmother, helplessly hanging upside down in her car, and the corn stalks several miles away. The old man had just walked into the house and set his lunchbox on the counter. He was explaining to Mom that management had sent everybody home a couple hours early today because of the heat when his sharp ears picked up the growl of the siren tower. He cocked his head to be sure, then bolted for the door without finishing his sentence. Mom, who had heard the siren as well, picked up the lunchbox and emptied it as the old man sprinted for the Chrysler. The engine fired and the car surged forward toward the firehouse. With the siren blasting, the old man streaked for the firehouse. Then, as he bounded over the curb, he shut off the engine and bailed out as the car rolled toward the corner of the firehouse. By the time the car stopped rolling, Jack was already in the overhead door. Eddie, who was already in the firehouse, had answered the phone and was writing highway intersection 2 miles south car wreck on the chalkboard over the phone. The old man took one look at the board, then kicked off his shoes and stepped into his boots and headed for the truck. Rex Sorensen was already in the driver's seat, with the motor running and the red lights turning as the old man piled into the passenger side. Rex eased out of the door, and the old man stepped onto the siren switch as they turned for the state highway. It took just a shade over 5 minutes from the time Queenie placed the call until the first fire truck eased to a stop next to Jesse's upside-down car. The old man grabbed a pry bar and a first aid kit, then headed to the corner of the car. He had not really noticed yet that the car was his mother-in-law's. Rex headed for the other car, where the dazed driver was walking aimlessly up and down the road, obviously in shock from the collision. A moment later, Jack's face appeared next to Jesse's shattered window, and he realized who was in the car. He laid the equipment down next to the window and leaned in. "This the best parking job you could do?" he asked in a light tone, peering into the car. Then added, "Are you hurt?" "I don't know. I'm dizzy from being upside down, but I can't tell if I'm hurt or not," replied Jesse in a matter-of-fact tone. "Okay, we'll have you out of here in a jiffy," said the old man. "And I'm sorry. I'm giggling because I hear this in my grandmother's voice. And I hear this in my grandfather's voice. And so, I can hear her matter-of-fact tone and her very precise words. So, it makes me giggle. Okay, we'll have you out of here in a jiffy," said the old man. He turned to call Eddie, standing next to the pumper. "Eddie, bring the backboard and the seatbelt knife. I'm gonna need help cutting her out. She's upside down." "Be right there, Jack," called Eddie. He hurriedly gathered the equipment and a moment later appeared next to the car. Eddie stomped down the corn stalks to make room as he handed Jack the tool used to cut the seatbelts. The sharp blades of the knife were covered so that the seatbelt could be hooked and easily cut without any danger to the occupant. The old man shimmied into the car through the now missing passenger side window and positioned a knee under Grandma's shoulder so that when the belt was cut, she wouldn't fall directly onto her head. Eddie used a pry bar to force open the driver's side door, then steadied Jesse from the other side. The old man slit the belt in a single deft motion, and the weight of Jesse's body instantly transferred from the belt onto the old man's knee. He and Eddie eased her down onto the back of the roof of the car, which was now on the bottom, then moved her legs toward the window. Other firemen appeared at the side of the car, and Jessie eased out the broken window on the backboard. Her neck was secured with a cervical collar. Then she was carried up the bank to the highway, covered with a blanket to prevent shock while waiting for the ambulance. A quick assessment indicated she'd probably broken her clavicle, and a lot of until the ambulance arrived. Jesse was then whisked away to the county hospital, along with the driver of the other car. Once the injured had been removed, the old man walked over to Sheriff Jim Woolridge. Woolridge, who had arrived during the confusion, was directing his deputies to provide traffic control until the highway patrol arrived. "Jim, that's my mother-in-law they just took to the ambulance," said the old man. "Yeah, I heard that, Red," answered the sheriff. "We need to go tell Ralph that she's hurt," said the old man. "Okay, you want me to do it?" asked Woolridge. "Well, yes and no," said the old man. "I'll do it, but I need you to run me over to their farm. I came in the fire truck." "No problem. Let's head over there right now," replied the sheriff, motioning his deputy that he was leaving. They walked toward the unmarked car and the men got in. The old man threw his gear in the back seat, and Jim drove to Ralph and Jesse's farm. They found Ralph in the workshop, quite oblivious to all the activity only 2 miles down the road. "Hey, Jack was just talking about you this morning," Ralph called, smiling. The old man walked into the shop. When Ralph saw the sheriff following Jack, he asked in a more worried tone, "Is everything okay?" "No," the old man responded. "Jessie's been involved in an accident. She's gonna be okay, but she's hurt. They just took her to the hospital." "How bad?" asked Ralph quickly. "I'm not sure, but I don't think it's anything life-threatening. Probably a broken collarbone and maybe some other stuff. They're gonna check her at the ER," said the old man. Ralph had already begun to turn off the equipment as the old man talked. The conversation rapidly moved outside as Ralph started for the house, even before the old man finished talking. "I'm gonna wash up my hands and head to the hospital then," said Ralph. "Just remember what Red told you, Ralph," offered the sheriff. "She's gonna be okay, and there's no good in you getting excited, driving too fast, and having another wreck on the way to the hospital." Ralph stopped and looked at the sheriff quizzically for a moment. Then, with a profound look of insight replaced the puzzled expression, he nodded slowly and said, "You're absolutely right, Sheriff. I'll take it easy," and disappeared into the house. The sheriff returned the old man to the accident scene, and Ralph, true to his word, made his way carefully to the hospital. The highway patrol troopers arrived to investigate the wreck, but it was hours before the mess was cleaned up. The old man returned home to find that Mom had already gone to the firehouse, retrieved the Chrysler, and gone to the ER without him. My grandmother recovered without permanent injury, except possibly to her pride, and from that point on until the end of her life, she drove the biggest car that she could find, usually Buick Electras, Park Avenues, or LeSabres. It served her well, too, because she was hit by another driver about 15 years later while driving my brother's kids to town, and the larger car probably saved her life, as well as the lives of the 3 children in her car. And for as long as she lived, I never heard her say another word about how fast the firemen drove on the highway on the way to an emergency. Perhaps it was something about hanging upside down in a seatbelt, waiting for help, that made her finally understand why the men were in such a hurry. And that is where I'm going to leave it off for now. That is where I'm going to leave it off for now. If you enjoyed the book, please let me know by liking this video and subscribing